And I want to welcome those of you who are joining us live tonight. My name is Tim Cole, and I'm the director at Waypoint Church Partners, and you're viewing the Waypoint 55 webinar, which is our monthly webinar for lay leaders in the church on ministry-related topics in 55 minutes or less. And so we have a webinar every month for ministry leaders that might be serving as the leader of their prayer team, or as an elder, or the safety and security team, or their missions team, leading their missions team at their church, or a variety of other places, men's ministry, women's ministry, and so on. So we're thankful that you're joining us tonight. And as always, give thanks and a shout out to Mid-Atlantic Christian University, who is our regional ministry partner that has been our sponsor of our webinar platform since we began 5 years ago. And we serve in the same region and all the same churches. There's 505 churches in the Waypoint region that we have an opportunity to try and serve. And so if you're in the Waypoint region, we want to say welcome. And if you're outside of the Waypoint region, we still want to say welcome. But Mid-Atlantic is our sponsor for tonight. We want to say thank you to them for allowing us to serve you all in this way. And so we have been doing this for about 5 years. And so if you don't know this already, Waypoint has a YouTube channel. If you just search in YouTube for Waypoint Church Partners, you'll find that all of our webinars are there. They're organized by playlist. And so there's one playlist that's just all the missions topics in particular. And so there's about 10 of them that are there. And so I want to invite you to go there, and you can watch some of the older webinars. I'm losing that very quickly. So we've got our YouTube channel there with all the different playlists. One of the ones that kind of addresses our topic tonight is one from a couple of years ago called Mind the Gaps, transition your church from caring about your missionaries to caring for your missionaries. And so you can see since then we've had about 64 more leaders that have viewed that after the fact. And so we are talking tonight about caring for your missionary kids in particular, but it's the same kind of idea of how can your church transition from caring about your missionaries to actually physically caring for them in some really practical ways. And so if you go to our YouTube channel, would like to invite you to subscribe. You hit the subscribe button, and that way it'll kind of show up in your feed when you go onto YouTube. It'll appear on your screen, some of the most recent webinars that we've put on there. And if you hit the little bell notification, then you'll actually be notified when the next one gets posted there. And as always, you are our best advertisement for some of our former webinars, because you may not be interested in security or elders or prayer team, but there are leaders at your church that you know that you could recommend that they check out those webinars as well. And so so if you do that for us, that'd be great. But tonight what we're going to be talking about is this whole idea about missionary care in general, but missionary kid care in specific. And so we've got a great couple that are friends of mine that are going to be joining us tonight, or they have joined us tonight, Josh and Denise Beck. They're kind of a power couple because they're both executive directors of missionary organizations. And so, well, Josh, not yet,
right.
Almost.
Yeah.
What did they call that back in the day? Very soon, but former missionaries in South Sudan for many years. And then Josh has been serving as the missions pastor at a large church in Joplin, Missouri, and that's where we met through some family connections there. And then Denise you're the executive director of Velvet Ashes, which is an online, if I got this right, an online digital community for ladies serving globally. And I imagine that could go all kind of ways in great ways. And so, yeah, so that's that's where I hope I got that right. And so,
yes.
For those of you who are joining us online tonight, there's a follow-up email that you'll get after the fact, and we will have links to both Velvet Ashes and to Samaritan, our Barnabas International. Sorry about that, where Josh is headed here very soon. When do you start officially, Josh?
July 1st. So there's about a 4-month transition. Yeah.
Okay. And Barnabas International is one of the best known missionary care organizations interdenominationally here in the United States. And so he'll be diving in to that using the experience he's had both at the church and there. And so tell me, first of all, how many kids you guys have? You got a whole house full, or used to?
We used to. Yeah, we have 4 kids.
4 kids. Yeah.
All in college. So
All right.
feel for us on that big, heavy paycheck. But yes, our youngest is now 19 and our oldest is 25.
All right. So how old were your kids when you were on the field, just as a frame of reference for being parents of missionary kids?
Yeah. When we went to the field, our oldest was 12, which actually is many mission sending organizations recommend you don't take a child that old because they've lived so many years in the States and then try to make that cultural transition. But our oldest was 12, our youngest was 5. Did I get it right?
You did. Very well.
Okay, thanks.
All right. And the other 2 were middle kids somewhere in the middle.
Middle kids, yes. They had to be resilient.
We call them the bread. We call them the meat and cheese. You got the bread, and then you got the meat and cheese. So,
all right.
Yeah.
Well, I'm curious. After you served there, then came back to the States. I'm curious. Number one, just talking about missionary care in general. And before I do this, I want to say, if you're joining us online tonight, if you have a question, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And if you think of a question, go ahead and type it in as soon as you think of it, because we see it in a queue on the side of our screen. And if we're able to answer it at that time or by the end of the webinar, we'll be able to do that or email you after the fact to answer your question. So if you have a question, go ahead and type that in as soon as you think about it. Don't wait. And it's one of the values of being able to join our webinars live. You will be able to join our webinar after the fact, but not ask questions. And so that's the benefit there. So please ask a question of Josh and Denise if you think of one. But I'm curious, before you went to the field, and what year did you leave the United States to go onto the field?
We left in 2010.
Okay, 2010, so 13 years ago. So what awareness did you have of missionary care, leader care, member care at all before you left, compared to where you're at now 13 years later?
Yeah. We had some knowledge of it because College Heights has they're the church that I work for right now, and they're the ones that raised us up and sent us out. They have a really strong DNA of mobilizing and sending out missionaries to unreached people groups. And so we had some, like, we had a care team that was taking care of us, a member care specialist that was doing pre-field counseling and things like that. But what really actually going through that process and living overseas, what it did is it kind of it impressed upon us as we were beneficiaries of member care, to say it that way. It impressed upon us the need and the value that member care, the role that member care plays in overseas work and living cross-culturally. And so then, comparatively speaking to where we are today, 13 years later, we've now not only been beneficiaries, but now we've got to be providers of the missionary care that was given to us, and we get to pass that on in mentoring roles, working with young men and women looking to go overseas, as well as shepherding and caring for the missionaries that are currently overseas for College Heights, living among 6 unreached people groups that we send people to, many of them with children. So, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm curious, for those that might be new to the missions and that they're serving at their church and they're now drew the short straw and they're the missions committee chairman, or no one else raised their hand and so they're willing to do it. But give us a real quick snapshot of what, when we talk about member care, and maybe both of you could speak to this a little bit, but for a person that hadn't ever thought about member care before, because missionaries are just perfect people and they go overseas and everything's awesome. Right. What is member care in general before we start talking about missionary kid care in specific?
Yeah.
I'll let you go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah. So like member care in in our own words, for those who are lay leaders in churches or maybe serve on a missions committee or eldership or something like that, really member care, it can be a confusing term because a lot of times you think, oh, is that care for the members of the church? Is that care? Who's the member, right? But we use that term in the missions world for shepherding, walking with, and caring for missionaries, basically just walking them towards relative health and spiritually, physically, mentally, emotionally, just how do we care for them holistically in order for them to have longevity, to be in a healthy place, to not burn out, and those kinds of things. And so that's when we say member care in the missions world, what we're talking about is shepherding and care for the missionaries kind of on those levels. So would you add anything?
I would just add that I think, there's different levels of missionary care, of member care. So your bigger churches may have a lot of resources and may be able to provide in a different way, but we had some of the most special care done from small churches that were really personal and intentional. And so I think that it can happen on a broad scale. Like, yes, missionaries that are sent out may have layers of member care from different sending orgs or sending churches, but it can be very powerful no matter the size of the church to be cared for well by anybody. So I would just say it's very meaningful.
Yeah, I would even add that within, like we talk about missionary kids, there's also some acronyms that might help too when it comes to this, because right, we say MKs, which is missionary kids, but we also say TCKs, which is third culture kids. And so I would add a caveat that if you hear us using those terms, it's all the same thing. It's kind of care for kids also. So if that makes sense.
Do you feel like maybe the viewers understand what TCK is?
Probably not. So, even MKs might be a new, an acronym just for missionary kids. But so flesh that out a little bit about what not just what the words are, but what the words mean for us there, because that's I think it's a good understanding.
Yeah. So when you think about, someone, I think most all of us watching would be, say, we're American and we understand our culture and we understand the things, the inside jokes, the culturally relevant jokes, the things about even just the weather and the seasons. And we all have that frame of reference. And so that we're one culture people. Well, when a missionary kid, an MK, spends part of their time in this culture, but then is very shaped and formed by another culture, they see themselves as not fully from this other culture either, because they have partly been shaped in America and partly shaped by this culture that they are moving to, that they are growing up in. And so what they are is not fully in one culture and not fully in this culture. And so they've created this third culture, which is a mix of the cultures that have shaped them, and it's uniquely them. And so whenever we're talking about third culture, it's these kids that don't feel like they really belong to any one culture. And just by being a third culture kid, they relate really well to other third culture kids, even if those two cultures that have shaped them are very different. It's this idea of we don't really feel like we fit anywhere.
Yeah.
And so when we say TCK, we're talking about this group of children that grew up, and TCKs grow up to be adults that still feel this way, that they are third culture in some way, that they don't fully fit in any one culture. They're not going to get the references that you have said about the life during the season when they weren't a part of it.
Yeah. And with that comes unique attributes, unique ways of looking at the world. Their worldview is different. And so it can be confusing for some of us here in the US who maybe have never lived a season of life outside of our passport culture, to then relate to these kids who are maybe on furlough or home service, and then they come back for 2 or 3 months, right? And they're the same little kids that we held 3 years ago when we saw them off, and I don't understand, and so the interactions become unique, and because they see the world differently. So yeah, it is kind of a whole world you can kind of get into and dig into.
Yeah.
I think a little bit later, when we talk practically, it's going to be really important to understand that about these kids
Yeah.
when you're trying to think of practical ways that you can serve and relate and love them well.
Yeah.
I was going to say, you guys experienced this firsthand because your kids were old enough to really know both cultures. As they weren't toddlers when you left, and so or born there, but they were 5 to 12, and so I don't know about your 5-year-old. I'm sure, and all 4 of them were at different stages of life in America before they left.
Yep.
And then were in this other culture that they had to figure out how to live in and embrace. I think I was first challenged by trying to understand third culture. Was had some friends who were missionaries, and they came back to the States, and the parents, our friends, told us, about the kids struggling to repatriate, to come back. But mostly part of the issue was every American's assumptions that the kids are excited to be back in America. Like, who wouldn't be excited to be back in America?
Yeah.
Because their passports are United States passports. So surely they're thrilled to come back home to America. And they told us our kids are not excited about coming back to America, but everybody pats them on the head saying, aren't you so glad to be back in America? And they have to smile and nod and pretend like they are. And that really struck me, as I had never thought that a kid wouldn't love to come back home to America, and
Yep.
that was my first interaction with that personally. But I think that kind of helps set the stage for missionary kids, is trying to get inside their mind after you've been outside the States for a little while. Particularly, I'm curious what you would say about missionary kids in general, or your kids in specific, before we get into some practical stuff, but particularly about the church, the American church, or their spiritual journeys overseas as they're serving overseas, because I think people in churches in America just make assumptions about that as well. So for kids growing up as missionary kids, their parents are missionaries, whether they like it or not. I'm curious if you can just speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. There's some interesting dynamics created there for sure. I would say, first of all, in parents, there's even some interesting dynamics as they come back to the U.S. and maybe are standing up on a stage or giving a sermon or telling stories of what life is like across the ocean or wherever they are. There's an interesting dynamic that can be created. It's not always, but where maybe it's like there could be guilt, right? You could parent out of guilt. We do that whether we live in another country or not. But it's like, oh, the call was put on our life, not my kids, but here I am dragging my kids across the ocean. And so it's possible for there to be even some weird dynamics at play with the parents also, which is key when you're in a local church and you're ministering to missionaries who are off the field for a little bit. It's understanding that, there might be some dynamics there. It's learning to ask good questions about that. But then as you get into the kids, there's some unique things, like you already mentioned. Defining home is, the word home means something else to missionary kids than it does to maybe you. So even comments like, aren't you so glad to be home? And that throws a missionary kid off. And so our own experience with our kids has been this. I think there's a good principle that all of us can understand, is that when you minister to someone's kids, you're actually ministering to them. And we've seen that firsthand, we've experienced it, and then we've gotten to minister to other families also who are serving cross-culturally. I remember we had to go make a church visit. We were back on furlough. We had to make a church visit to a church down in Lubbock, Texas, right? Which also looks like Sudan, just so you know. I don't know if any of you are from Lubbock, Texas, but like the lay of the land. Anyways, we drove through there and was like, whoa. And so, but
Always, right?
Yeah. So we visited this church, and we'd never been to this church. I'd had interactions with the church leaders a bit. But as we come in, they're having a big evening kind of gathering for us to come speak at and tell stories and things like that. And so they put Denise and I up front, and they said, hey, we're just going to pray to start off with. And they kind of just called someone out of, I don't know, there's 100, 150 people there. They kind of just called a name. Hey, Larry, I don't know what his name was. Would you stand up and just pray for tonight and pray for the Becks as we get to hear. And so he stands up and he starts praying, and he named every single one of my kids in that prayer. I've never met the guy. We've never been to this church. And he named, and I remember the weight of that actually falling on us. Like they know my kids' names and pray for my kids by name. Huge moment, impressing upon us. Okay, you minister to someone's kids, you minister to them. And so I think that's one way in the local church that we can actually kind of get our hands dirty with, how do we care for, how do we do this right member care with the missionaries that we've sent out with and that we have the opportunity to walk alongside of. And so I think, man, it's like when Jesus gave the mandate to go, that also means there's a mandate to send. And when there's a mandate to send, there's also a mandate to care for and shepherd and walk with those missionaries and with their families. And so, yeah, it's been good.
Yeah, and I would just say that, one of the things you alluded to before is that, people might assume that because your kids are missionary kids, they're super Christians and they've got it all figured out. And I would say they are probably very confused, just like any kid growing up on any continent is trying to figure out where Jesus fits into their life and how it fits into their experiences and what they want to do as far as accepting him and following him. And just because their parents are missionaries doesn't mean that they aren't going through their own journey with that. And when they are home and it's assumed by the church they're visiting that they're going to be at this level, they could speak into this or do this, or they're comfortable with this, that's an assumption that is just not fair to make for those kids, because yes, they have probably witnessed and seen and been taught things on another level, but that doesn't mean that you can assume anything about where they have landed and untying all of those knots for themselves.
Good.
So there's that aspect of it, but then there's the aspect of so continue to pray for those MKs for their spiritual journey. Continue to resource them and connect them with youth group leaders and encourage the kids in that way, and don't necessarily put them on a pedestal that they don't want to be on, and so I would just, as you speak into that, I would say in my experience with shepherding women, one of the big things is that they don't know where a safe space is to talk about my kids are struggling, because they feel like they've been put on this pedestal. And yes, we should be winning the lost here in this country to Christ, but it goes without saying that my kids should then also be better and one and all on board and everything. And so when that's not the case, or when their kids are struggling with their faith or with anything that this culture is struggling with, they feel like we're not allowed to say that. And where do we go? And so, there's this reality that's kind of a little bit of a hidden place where when our kids are struggling, it's causing a struggle for our missionaries, our global workers, because they don't know how to walk through that well and still do the job that they've been called to do.
So as a local church, then it creates a real importance to be able to be a safe space for your missionaries as they come back. Ask the good questions and be a safe, like, hey, how are your kids doing? How's their faith? What can we do to walk with you through this? I think that impresses upon the local church to be able to do that well.
Yeah,
because they might not be getting that anywhere.
Yeah, it's very likely not.
Yeah.
Well, before we transition to some of the practical stuff, I don't know how much you're willing to share, and so you guys make that. But I'm curious, for your 4 kids, kind of what was the range of ways they transitioned out of America, different from each other? What was the more the contrast than the comparison for the way they handled being in Africa versus there?
Yeah. I think there's another principle built into that the answer to this question is that a lot of times if parents view kind of the role of the kids and their family and how the kids are transitioning, or they view leaving their passport culture and going to a new one, if if there's any of that where they primarily view it as negative, right, then that'll bleed off on the kids, and the kids will actually get their temperature, their pulse, however you want to put that, from the parents. And so if it's like, oh, I'm so sorry we're doing this, well, then all of a sudden that's transferred to the kids as, oh, this is actually a really horrible thing or something. And so it's important for people around these kids to kind of, for lack of a better term, give off the right vibes. Like, no, this is an adventure that God is bringing us on. And so if you approach it in that way, as you prepare, like the Lord's leading us on quite an adventure, and we get to do this. So that's the way we chose to approach it. Someone taught us that principle early in the process. And so we approached it that way with our kids, and it was more of an adventure than we planned. And so there were a lot of ups and downs along the way. Our kids transitioned there quite well. I would say there were no huge hiccups or problems. The interesting thing is I think our kids transitioned back to the US. When we moved back to the US, that was a rougher transition. And so that was harder on them, and even their own kind of faith journey in what the Lord has done with us and with our family has had its own bumps, its own ups and downs that we get to walk through with our kids also.
Well, and I would just also say, like, it depends on how you define the transition, because from the outside we have, top scores on ACTs, we have homecoming queen, and we have winning basketball tournament, star basketball player. We have like all of these outward things that some people struggle to fit back into the school structure and struggle to do well in school and struggle to make friends. And that was not the transition trouble that our kids had. They were well liked, they fit in really well, they achieved success, president of the student body, like all of that stuff. That was our kids' transition back. So from the outside, that looks like fantastic. And I would say spiritually, we have had some really great moments, and we've had some moments of questioning, because honestly, some of the things entering back into America after living in a third world country was they just felt like, I don't know if I agree with everything, and it's not okay to not agree with that. And I don't know where that fits. And so we have been back now for 6-7 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I still feel like they're untangling. How do they live in America when their hearts were shaped in a different country? And we are still seeing that play out, but we still have kids that love Jesus. They're just asking hard questions. And I think that's just sticky. I think it's going to be a long road. And so
one of our kids was baptized there. And so that's kind of a neat stake in the ground thing that he definitely marks out in his life. I know that each of our kids transition differently. So even when they came back, like we have one child that ended up almost like becoming a chameleon, like trying to fit in wherever they could, because they realized, oh, I don't fit in, so I'm going to study. And I remember he came to us like 3 days after coming back into the US, and he had a list of things we had to buy that he could fit in with all of he was for like 3 days. He like paid attention, made a list. I need these shoes, I need these socks that pull all the way up, I need these kinds of shorts, and that will help me fit in, and I won't be so weird, or I won't be so odd, or whatever it is. And so they all transition in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. Well, it's great to think through that. So let's transition to the more practical side and just ask, from your perspective or your suggestions for people that are in churches, whether the church is running 60 or 160 or 560, doesn't matter. What are just some practical ways that churches can try and care for their missionary kids rather than just care about their missionary kids? Well, first of all, they need to care about their missionary kids.
Yes.
That's a good start.
That's a good start.
But then to even take it to a whole nother level and start caring for their missionary kids, probably in ways that hopefully on this webinar tonight, most people hadn't even thought of some of the just real simple, practical ways that they can do that. If someone asked you, so how can we care for our missionary kids better, for the missionary for the missionaries of our church that have kids. That's number one, is figure out which ones have kids. Hopefully, but if you don't, that's the first step, is figure out which ones have kids. And then what are just your list of some of your favorite ideas that you've seen other people do, or people did for you, or things that you've done?
Yeah. You want to start?
Yeah, I think if we could take just even a minute to help define a mindset that, as you are thinking about serving, seeing, observing, being around missionary kids, like, these are some good things to know. So we kind of talked about that defining home for them is going to be challenging. So if you're aware of that and you're not saying things like welcome home, we're so glad you're home, realizing they might be thinking of the place they just left when you say the word home, you know, so understanding that just in the verbiage that you use around them. I would just say, be curious instead of making assumptions that, oh, are you so glad to do this? Or ask them questions about, hey, what did you love? What did you miss? What are you excited about? If you have the posture of curiosity when you're talking to them, you're going to actually then begin to fill in the pieces of how to interact with this particular MK, because you're going to understand what's important to them and not make that assumption. A lot of times, it's like, oh, do you know another language? Hey, say these words. How do you say it in this language? And it becomes like they're on show. You're at the zoo and you're looking at this kid to perform for you. And so being aware that they may not want to always, in every room they go in, have people put them on display and have us show us about everything. For a lot of the kids, for our kids, they were the only white kids in a whole culture of Black kids. And so for some, it was the first and only white kids they had ever seen. So they have always been on display, and they're looking forward to blending in when they come back. And so when you separate them out and put them up and say, do a show for us, tell us about all the things, you are their nightmare, because they have just wanted to come in and blend back in. Taking the parents' lead on, don't call the kids up if they haven't been prepped for that. A lot of times parents need to tell their kids, okay, you're going to be on stage with us. It's going to happen like this. I want you to come and stand with us. And if you haven't talked with the parents about that, it could really panic the children who were not prepped to be up on stage. And so just even practically understanding that they want to maybe not stand out here. And so those kinds of just ideas about that would be just some caveats. And I would just say another thing that might be really challenging is this idea of patriotism. We lived in a community where people were forced into nationalism. They were forced, sometimes with violence, into having to say things like the pledge and to sing the national anthem. And so it was a confusing thing for our kids to come back and everybody stand up and sing the national anthem or say the Pledge of Allegiance, because that was a bad thing in the country we were at. People were killed because they weren't obeying how they were. And so understanding that it's a complicated thing for some of them to wrap their heads around, this isn't the same type of culture. This is a good reason why these people want to stand up and say this. And so just having a lot of grace for where they might have come and the things that they're being asked to do, and that it's complicated for them in a way that we don't understand, So that would just be some of the caveats as just a frame of reference as you're entering into this relationship with your TCKs.
And I think people being on a committee in a local church context as a sending church, it would be good for them to even talk about those things with their missions committee, with the people that are going to be picking them up from the airport, or whatever those things are, is making them aware, almost training. Here's things to say, things, the good questions to ask when you're in the van with them, things like that. So yeah, I think something that has been a blessing to us is that our kids were known. That's a big deal. So what ways can churches make the missionary kids known to the congregation, not in a put them up on stage type of thing, but in they walk into the church and somebody knows their names, and in some really good ways. And so there are different ways that you could do that, creative ways. It could be even things like making prayer cards and making that part of the kids programming that they do throughout the year. They know, hey, we're praying for these missionary kids. They live in Mexico, or they live in Eastern Europe, or wherever, and they're able, so when those kids show up and are in that class, it's like, oh yeah, we've been praying for you. That's cool. So definitely making them known. A big issue with that families deal with, and that a lot of times they need help with, is schooling. Schooling of missionary kids is a big issue that comes up over and over. I mean, we had to deal with it. It's like you have to make a decision. Do I send them to the public school? Do I homeschool them? Are we allowed to homeschool in this country? Do I send them to a private international school? Some cool things that churches can do is actually help them walk through those different decisions. Come alongside of them. What can we do to resource you to make sure that your kids are schooled to the level that they need to be? How can we get them assessed, right? There's even a organization called Share, and they do, in Budapest, they do assessments where you can bring your family there and they'll assess what level is your kid at the right level of schooling for their for where they should be, and track that. And those are practical ways that churches can come alongside of missionary families and say, let us help you assess your kids. Let us help you take these tests, the MAP testing and things like that.
With one of our kids, when we were back on furlough, I was like, I just don't think he's reading at the right level. And there was a retired teacher who's just like, well, let me just spend time with him. Let me sit with him and read with him. And
Yeah.
she was able to give me this, oh, he's fine. Don't worry, and just that was so reassuring to me. And it was great for them to build this relationship,
Yeah. Another fun thing that is very practical is actually a lot of our local churches, no matter what size they are, will build VBS curriculum during the summer, right? So we'll come up with some fun ideas, have fun games, and actually recently I've seen a lot of churches are making, maybe it's video curriculum that goes along with the in-person experience and those kinds of things. It's a fun idea to actually send some of those send the curriculum to your missionary families that are overseas, so they can have a similar experience where they are with their kids. They don't have to put it together. It's all put together for them. Hey, we're going to send this to you. We're going to email you the video files and email the documents, and you can play these games with your kids. And it's a fun way to actually come alongside of the parents as the parents are walking through spiritual growth with their children. Because not only are the parents there, I mean, the parents are there, they have to disciple their children too. They're there not just to plant a church or run DBS groups in this country. It's like, no, they have kids to disciple. How can we partner with those parents to disciple their kids spiritually too?
On that same note, sometimes you have VBS t-shirts made, or there's something, and when you have MKs that are of that age, maybe send those to them with that curriculum. So they've got the t-shirt. I will just say a caveat on sending packages is check with your global partner to make sure that they can receive packages, because sometimes it costs them. We would get a package that cost us $75 to $100 just to pick up at the post office. And it'd be like, straws and mac and cheese packets or something that to us wasn't worth the $75, so just be sure if you do send packages that you have communicated and that's something that they can receive there.
Yeah. The other big thing is I would encourage, if possible, and I know it's not always possible, but I would encourage churches to put their money where their mouth is. If you want to take care of missionary families, missionary kids, then back it up with a budget line item that says, hey, we use this line item for CIY camps. When our families are back in the States, we could pay to send them to CIY or pay to send them to another Bible camp that your church uses, so that's not an extra burden on the missionary family. There are also, so I know that's kind of a touchy subject sometimes. It's like, oh yeah, whatever, but because it's budget. But the truth is it's like, if you want to do this, let's put our money where our mouth is, and let's make a line item to care for these missionary families, kids included, and walk through different things with them, give them the experience that other kids are having to that's for their own spiritual growth and stuff like that. So
Yeah, I think those are some practical things. And I would just say, even if you could encourage your youth ministers to begin forming relationships with these kids, because 9 out of 10 times there's not that opportunity for them to be invested in by a youth minister. It's their parents are putting on the programming at this church. They are the children's ministers. And so having somebody else outside that just takes a special interest in your kids. And then they're known when they come back to your church and they feel that connection and it's a safe space for them there.
Yeah. There are a host of resources out there too, Tim. I actually brought some books from my office today that we give out to people. So there's like these just simple books. I don't know if that's backwards on the webinar or not. Is that backwards?
No, that's
okay.
All right.
So it's like, yeah, it's just very practical things. Here's parents of missionaries. Here's grand loving. It's just like, how do you actually, some of the principles and different chapters in these books are super helpful to go, how do we love on kids from a distance, but also how do we love on them when they're back? And and so there's all kinds of book resources, resources like websites. To give a shameless plug for Barnabas International, where I'm going, they even have Mukapa chapters, which are like chapters on college campuses. They get on college campuses as missionary kids transition back for college or things like that. And they have experts in missionary care that are part of Barnabas International. And there's other organizations out there too that specialize in member care, and especially member care to children or children in transition, a very natural time for families to come off the field, or for students, even if it's not with the whole family to come off the field, is when they go to college. And so they'll come back to the US for college, and that's a good time to be able to minister to them too. I could even send you some more like websites and stuff. I don't know if that's helpful.
We can put that in the follow-up email that goes out. And
okay.
So if you want to email those to me,
okay,
we can include those. That would be awesome. But then even just showing them on screen, people can the ones that you did show on screen, that'd be great.
Okay, that's great.
I'm curious from my own story, and I'm old enough that this was like pre data processor, but when I was a little kid, was like a pen pal for a while with a missionary kid, where you had to physically write, chicken scratch letter to send with. Remember the old what are they called, the air post for overseas?
Envelope.
Airmail envelope. You can write on the envelope and then you kind of stuck it all together.
Yep.
Times have changed. But I'm curious what you've seen, if anything, about kids having not pen pal, but phone pals, that there are kids that they meet and then they're able to communicate via WhatsApp or FaceTime or whatever, that kind of bridges the gap at all. Have you seen any of that? I don't know. You guys were missionaries 10 plus years ago. And I don't know how you feel about your kids having phones and all that kind of deal in South Sudan. But even in my kids, the different age of my kids, our opinion about kids having phones have changed over the last decade. So what do you see in that respect, if anything, with kids having not pen pals, but phone pals?
Well, I would say that it's a different world, because while they are still physically removed, you have a more connected group of people than you've ever had because of social media. So there is this bridge that happens because they can be connected based on how free the parents feel, with that. But one thing that I would say is done now is this video game. So I don't know how parents feel about that, but there are several people that you can get online and play video games with TCKs that are living, somewhere else. And so we have global partners who that's how some of their families
Yep.
stay connected. The aunts and uncles get on and you put your headphones on and you're playing video games and you're talking and it's real time. And that's how they're interacting if they were next door or in the same house in a different room. And so it doesn't feel like to them their culture's away because they're all engaged in this video game, so that's a totally different thing than we had, like what you're talking about from airmail days. But yeah, there are so many different ways for kids to stay connected. And I would just say that the danger that I think the transition piece for some of these TCKs is they think that they're so different that they swing the pendulum to the other way when they enter into a culture of they have to change who they are to try to fit in. And there's probably less of that difference that's actually happening now because there's so much social media and ways for them to be aware of what's happening than ever has in the past. But it's this mental shift of, I don't want to not fit in, so I have to change everything about myself to try to fit in. And that's where a lot of the transition problems happen for TCKs. But yeah, you're right. There are definitely ways to stay connected that we did not have years ago, even just from the 6 years ago when our kids left.
Social media, all of that is included. So, yeah.
All right. Well, I don't know if there's anything else that you were hoping to share tonight, but if there is, speak now or forever hold your peace. But this has just been a great orientation for folks, I think, to think about, just even put on the lenses of families overseas, global workers overseas, and they've got kids and their parents, and they're trying to raise these kids in this odd place that they're in. They're from two different cultures, far apart, and just to put on those lenses for a little bit will change the way that they think about their own missionary kids that they support and serve from their church.
Well, yeah.
Well, if you have more questions for Denise or Josh, if with your permission, I'm going to give your email address out if they've got questions. Particularly, it's not a shameless plug. I'd love to plug if you've got missionaries who are needing some care, then either of your organizations would work out well for that. Barnabas International has workers all over the world who care for missionaries.
That's right.
And so there's probably one very close to your missionary wherever they're serving. Yeah. But then if your church supports gals who are serving overseas, for them to be part of a digital community where they can share about that, Velvet Ashes is the place that can connect them. And so I'm going to include your email so that people that are watching this webinar tonight or after the fact on demand can contact you about how can we connect our missionaries to your organization so that they can be served better. All right. Well, let me share the screen. We'll just a little bit here, back to here, and let me tell you just a little bit about some things that are upcoming at Waypoint. Next month, our next webinar, we have 2 webinars every year for elders in particular. And so next month, we're going to be talking about elder covenants, and something that a lot of churches haven't thought about, but what they are and how they work and why they can be really powerful, that your elders have a shared understanding and agreement on what it's going to be like to be an elder at your church. And so you might want to recommend to your elders that they check out this webinar when it's coming next month on April 17th. Our last one that we did last month was about safety, building a safety team at your church. And one of our church planters is also the fire chief in his county, and which is an odd combination. And so he spoke to that about how to have a well-prepared team, and it's already gotten about 75 views in just the first month. And so I want to invite you to check that out along with all the other ones on our channel. And then finally, I want to say right now I'm in Richmond. Tomorrow morning, we're going to have our first of 5 preaching events in 5 states around our region. And so if you're watching this live or immediately after the fact from subscription, we'd love for you to recommend to your preacher, if he's already not coming, to The Art of the Sermon, featuring 3 great presenters where the guys don't tell you how to preach. They just talk about how they preach and how they've developed that over the years. And so we hope that you'll check that out. And if not this year, then next year. All right. So again, we always want to thank Mid-Atlantic Christian University for being our partner in ministry here in the region, and sharing the ministry burden for all the churches in our region and beyond. And so we're thankful for them, but we're really thankful for Josh and Denise. Thanks for joining us tonight, and for sharing from your perspective about caring for missionary kids, and just kind of an unheard of thought for most churches to think about how can we really proactively start reaching out to the families of the missionary families in our churches and their kids in particular. So thanks for sharing for that, and hope all your kids do great in college, and
Thank
you guys
you.
can financially survive the next
Right.
few years. And Josh, as you're transitioning to your new role here this summer, what a great opportunity, but great challenge it is to take on such a big role there. While Denise, your role with Velvet Ashes, what a great ministry that you have to missionaries all over the world. It's really, really inspiring. So thanks for your time tonight.
Thanks for having
we hope
us.
to see the rest of you on one of our future webinars. But yeah, have a great night.